Well, thank you for being here tonight. We are recording this scholarly engagement event on assessment development. We are in for a treat as two of our doctoral candidates conducted assessment development, which is a beast in and of itself for their dissertation studies. And we will learn from their successes. And also maybe you'll tell us some of the pitfalls along the way too. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Tyler.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Do I have sharing preferences?
I just made you the co-host. It should have popped up.
Can you see it?
I can, yes.
Okay,
All
great.
right.
Well, my name is Tyler Orr. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Tennessee, and as of like a month ago, I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor in North Carolina and NCC. So I have a completely online counseling practice now, which is really great. One thing though is I'm a second year student. So this scale that I developed isn't for my dissertation. It was just for fun, I guess. It was just something because I'll talk about a therapy called constructed awareness. And for full transparency, I created constructed awareness. So the last 3 years I've been developing, teaching, and researching CA for short. So let's see. I want to say before I get into it that I developed this with a research partner of mine named Oliver McMahon, and we wrote a paper. And so basically I'm going to be presenting all the steps that we did to develop the scale and also kind of break down the paper. I thought that would be useful, especially if people are thinking about writing about it, because this is probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I'll be surprised if my dissertation is harder than this, because it was 3 years of trying to figure out how to do this, tons and tons of reading, trying to make sense of just what seemed like nonsense to me when I first started reading about it. It's a tough science, but hopefully I can help some of you, avoid some of the mistakes that I made.
And I'm just impressed that you took this on outside of a dissertation project, that you wouldn't be like, let me just put this on ice and then use it for my study. So I'm really impressed that you took on this beast, without it being the culmination of your doctoral work.
Well, technically, we started it before I was even in the program. So with constructed awareness, right off the bat, as soon as it was developed, I realized there was a need for a way to assess what it measures. So I'll talk about that as we go. So the learning objectives are, to summarize, CA. I'll tell you a little bit about it so you kind of understand what it's about. Identify the scale development procedures used to select items for the CAS, the constructed awareness scale is what it's called. Discuss pilot testing procedures, discuss the procedures for administering it to a larger sample, describe how to perform exploratory factor analysis and calculate internal reliability. And finally, examine the initial psychometric properties of the CAS with a sample of 361 participants. That included content validity, construct validity, and internal reliability. So to tell you a little bit about CA, I guess the easiest way to explain it is to talk about its 3 principles. That's usually what I do when I set it up with clients. So the first principle is if you bring awareness to something, it changes. So example is like little kids behave differently when they're home, when they're not being watched versus whenever they are being watched. And that's like example of an external thing where awareness changes the thing, but it's also true for our internal experience. So our thoughts and sensations. If we're not aware of our thoughts and sensations and behaviors, we're going to continue to think, feel, and behave in habitual ways. So with CA, we don't put any energy into trying to change the client's experience. We put all the energy into trying to deepen their awareness of their experience and trust that the awareness itself will be the catalyst of change. So what do we bring in awareness to? So the second principle is that the human experience is made of 3 building blocks, is what we call them in CA. So these are the 3 parts that construct our reality: thoughts, sensations, and external senses. So the building blocks are your mental building block, your sensation building block, and your external building block. And that's the theory behind the CA typology. And those are the 3 factors that we were attempting to measure with the development of this scale. So principle 3, most people naturally orient their awareness more strongly to one of the 3 building blocks, meaning that most people tend to rely on one part of their experience more than the other two to regulate themselves, to connect with others, to get their needs met. For example, I'm mentally oriented. I'll just give that away. I rely on my mind to get through life more than I do my external environment or my body. And I realized this doing EMDR. I'm a EMDR trained therapist. I'm a EMDR approved consultant. I used to be an EMDR trainer, so I did a lot of EMDR in the past. And if you're not familiar with EMDR, it's actually really easy for a therapist to do because you wave your fingers and the client follows with their eyes, and then you stop and say, what are you noticing now? And whatever they say, you say, notice that. You do it again. What are you noticing now? So you're asking that question, what are you noticing now, over and over again. And I noticed when doing EMDR that sometimes I would ask that questions, and certain, like, clients would answer different ways. Like some clients would answer with all thoughts, like they were trying to use logic and reason to rationalize their process in that moment. And I noticed that they were also doing that outside of session when they would describe their life. So I started to identify those clients as mentally oriented. And then some clients, I'd say, what are you noticing now? And they would have like physical reactions, like they would have these big cathartic releases and they would cry and shake. It's much more physical experience for them than me. And they also did that outside of their lives, in their regular lives. So I identified these clients as sensation oriented. And other clients seem to be more externally oriented. So they would talk about anybody but themselves when I'd ask, what are you noticing now? And I could tell a lot of times they were worried more about me. Like they would edit their responses to make sure I was comfortable. Right. And so that's when I started to see it's like everybody relies more on these different parts of their experience. And so came up with the 3 building blocks, the 3 primary orientations. And so here we have like M, E, and S, right? So mental stands for M, the E is for external, S is for sensation. So I thought, what happens if you put all these different building blocks in different combinations? And I realized it creates 6 combinations. So that's the basis of the CA typology. There are 6, we call them orientation types, but it's like personality types. And through just observation, clinical observation, I was able to identify particular traits, like predictable, like personality traits, attachment traits for each of those styles. So the problem was, it turns out that just making something up because it makes sense to me isn't the scientific rigor that people like journal editors are looking for, right? So I tried early on trying to come up with ways of assessing it, and it didn't work. Well, because I wasn't doing the scientific rigor. So once I started to kind of realize what was expected of me to do that, that's when this scale started to unfold, and it actually seems to work pretty well. So the rationale for the study is that CA's typology is untested. Like I said, it was developed solely through clinical observation. So the need for data, there was a need for data to support the theory. So that was important for me to begin to establish some empirical evidence so that CA therapists can trust that what they're doing has backing. And we also had a need for ways to assess orientation. And by the way, am I just going through this with no questions? Is that the plan? Whatever. So if anybody has one, you can jump in, I guess. Research questions for the study were, the first one is, what is the factor structure and validity of the CAS, including content and construct validity? And the second, what is the internal reliability of the CAS subscales? All right, I'm gonna move how y'all are showing up on my screen because it's blocking my view. Okay, so the scale development procedure, this was one of the hardest parts of the whole thing because there's just so much written about, there's just books and articles galore about how to develop a scale. And so I really struggled to make sense of like what to read and what was useful for me. These slides are a little wordier than I like to do because I'm hoping that like people in the future might be able to use this as a guide to walk through it. And also there's quite a few references because I tried to stick in the ones that I found were the most useful. Hopefully that'll help. But the steps that we took were determine what to measure, determine the format of the test, generate an item pool, have the initial item pool reviewed by experts, conduct pilot tests, and administer items to a development sample. And finally, we evaluated the items. Okay, so first, we'll just go through these step by step. Determine what to measure. So CA defines orientation. That's what we're defining, or we were measuring with this, what we call orientation with CA. It's defined as the fluid organization and reciprocal interplay of the client's mental, sensation, and external building blocks that lead to expressions of personality. So that sounds like a mouthful. Another way to look at it is orientation is how a client organizes their building blocks to regulate themselves, to connect with others, and to get their needs met. So we have the 3 subscales of orientation measured by the CAS. And as I said before, that's mental orientation M, external orientation E, and sensation orientation S. The next is to determine the format of the test. So the CAS is a multidimensional pre-assessment that measures orientation. We experimented during the pilot testing to figure out if we wanted to do a 4-point scale or a 5-point Likert scale. We played around, like there was one time we did one of the pilot tests, we actually just did both, the 4 and 5, and had the participants do the same, like do both of them. And through that process, we saw that for us, the 4-point scale had stronger Cronbach's alpha coefficients and factor loadings. So we decided to go ahead and go with the 4-point scale, which I liked better because it didn't have that middle neutral. So it created a forced positive or negative, and I liked that. So here's the scale we went with. So 1, strongly disagree, 2, disagree, 3, agree, 4, strongly agree. Next, we generated an item pool. So I came up with a lot of items, 196 single word items. Some of them were like 2 hyphenated words, but it's like basically single word items. 66 measured mental orientation, 69 were intended to measure external, 61 sensation. And these were developed using a rational theoretical approach to item construction, which is a really fancy way of saying I just made them up. Right. And so then we administered those, 196 items to panels. It says panel of experts. We actually did panels of experts. So this is like a Delphi study, very similar. So we assembled a panel of 15 experts to establish content validity. These researchers suggest that panels consist of content and lay experts. So our content experts were CA trained therapists who I know are really good at assessing orientation. And also just some non-therapists that we knew that were really good examples of fixed orientation types. And so let's see, so basically we took those 15 experts and we split them into 3 groups. So we had a panel of 5 mentally oriented, a panel of 5 externally oriented, and a panel of 5 sensation oriented. That makes sense to everybody? And we did something called content validity ratio. So this is something that if you're developing a skill, this would be really good to know. Lashi, I think is how you say it, developed this 3-point scale where the experts look at each item and they rate the essentiality of that item. So they would rate 1 for not essential, 2 for important but essential, and 3 for essential. So we're trying to get items that have the highest consensus. But this was pretty easy for our study because according to Lashi's guide, researchers should exclude items with a ratio of less of 1, so 100%, if the group expert has less than 7 members. So we had 5 in each group. So this was the easiest analysis for the whole thing, because if you didn't get 100% consensus, we threw the item out. And that reduced it down to 30 items. Went from 196 to 30. You would not believe how hard it is to get 5 people to agree on words, right? But that was cool. So that took out a lot. So we wound up with 9 mentally oriented items, 14 external, and 7 sensation. All right. So once we had those 30 items, we then moved on to pilot testing. We did 5 pilot tests. So using smaller samples allowed us to analyze the data, reevaluate the items and the number of items, and then retest. So I really liked this. It also allowed us to improve the Google form with each round. And I added this Hughes citation here because I found that to be really useful. This could be useful for anybody who's probably doing anything for a dissertation. So this article gave tips for how to make demographic sections more inclusive, which we found really useful. So Barker et al. Suggested using 20 to 30 participants for a pilot test. So the first 3 pilots we did between 20 and 30 participants. So it allowed us to kind of turn over really quickly and get information and make changes. But the last 2, we wanted to get a better understanding of like a more accurate picture of how the factor analysis would work. And it also like doing it this way really helped me to like understand how to do it, because it's like I'm working with new data over and over again. So by the time I got to that 4th and 5th pilot, I felt like I had a good grasp on how to do this stuff, right? So I thought that was really useful for me as a newbie. But the 4th and 5th, we used this, there was a 5-to-1 rule for exploratory analysis that I saw a lot in the literature. So by the time we got to the 4th pilot, we had reduced the items to 15. So 15 times 5 is 75. So our minimum sample size for the 4th and 5th pilot were 75. We use convenience and snowball sampling by distributing a Google form link to CA trained therapists and invited them to share the link with their professional and social networks. The inclusion criteria included they're able to give informed consent, they were at least 18 years of age, and they're able to speak, read, and write English. So we wound up with 22 participants for the first pilot, 25 for the second, 22 for the third, 92 for the 4th, and 83 for the 5th. So with each round, we used JASP to experiment with factor loading and Cronbach alpha to select the strongest items. So by the time we finished those 5 pilot tests, we had 15 items. So we reduced from 196 to 15 with 5 items for each of the 3 subscales. So 5 mental, 5 external, 5 sensation. So once that 15 item version was done, we moved on to administering it to a development sample, which was terrifying, by the way. You know, it's like you get this far and it's like, here's the moment of truth. So I tried really hard to figure out how to analyze power for this study. And I don't think it really exists, not what I could find. What I saw over and over in the literature for factor analysis, it's recommended to have at least 300 respondents. So that was our goal, to have a minimum of sample of 300. So just like the pilot study, we use convenience and snowball sampling using CA therapists to spread the word. And so they shared a Google form that consisted of informed consent, a 15-item CAS, and a demographic questionnaire in that order every time for everybody. We received 371 responses, and the inclusion criteria was the same as before, as the pilot. So able to give informed consent, at least 18 years old, and able to read, write, and speak English. Participants' ages ranged from 18 to 79, with a mean age of 43.86. We removed 10 items, or 10 responses, for not meeting inclusion criteria and repeated data. I think 2 people filled it out twice for some reason, so we just removed that. So we wound up with a final sample of 361. So next is testing the assumptions. So we use skewness and kurtosis to check normality. All the items were between -2 and +2. So the data seemed to be normal. Scatter plots showed positive linear correlations among items within each factor. These researchers with tough names recommended that the KMO test values greater than 0.5 indicate that the sample size was adequate to yield distinct and reliable factors. So in our case, our KMO test scores ranged from 0.71 to 0.83 with a total of 0.76. So we were good there. And also Bartlett, the creator of the Bartlett test, recommends that correlations between the items were large enough for factor analysis if you get a significant value. And so for us, we did have significance of the p-value of less than 0.001. And outliers in this study were not removed from the data set because the skewness and kurtosis were between that -2 and +2 range. Okay, so once the assumptions were checked, we moved on to exploratory factor analysis, EFA for short, to review the CAS's internal factor structure and delete items below 0.5. So, and I just have to say real quick, Dr. LA has said like exploratory factor analysis is advanced statistics. It is until you figure out how to do it. Like once you get into doing it in JASP, it's just as easy as doing descriptive statistics. I mean, you take the stuff from the left column and you move it over to the right column, and JASP creates a table that I'll show you here in a minute. Like it's really straightforward. There's a YouTube video that I watched and I was like, okay, I know how to do this now. But our commonalities ranged from 0.39 to 0.8. Now remember the cutoff's 0.5, so you can see right off the bat that we've got some that fell short. And at the end of the factor analysis, we wound up with a 3-factor final version that met all criteria and aligned with our theory, the CA theory that we started with, which was really exciting. So here is what the table that JASP created when I just dumped all 15 items over into the right column. And you can see like what we're hoping to see with this is 3 factors. Okay, so it did show 3 factors, which was exciting. But we needed to see, in order for this scale to work, equal items in with each factor. So hopefully we're hoping to see 5 in each one, but you can see there's 6 here, 5 here, and 4 here, right? So something's not right. So I started here with what seemed right. And I noticed that all of these items were the items that were intended to measure mental orientation. So that was good. So then I moved over here and noticed one's missing. Where is it? Right here, thoughtful got placed. This is external. These items are external. It threw an external item up in here with the sensation items. But you'll notice that the value is below 0.5. So I threw it out. I moved it back over into the left column. And also easily overwhelmed is a sensation item, but it's below 0.5, so got rid of it too. But that left us with 4 items in factor 1, 5 in factor 2, 4 items in factor 3. So what we did is we just threw out one of the low mental orientations. So that left us with this. This is the final table that's in the paper that we've submitted for publication. So we have 3 factors with 4 items within each factor. So factor 1 is the sensation orientation items, and those are emotional, deep feeler, emotive, and sensitive. Factor 2, those are the mental orientation items. They're logical, rational, reasoned, analytical. Factor 3 is external orientation items. We have cooperative, helpful, agreeable, and considerate. So next, once we had that, we took those 12 items and did reliability testing. We did the Cronbach's alpha, and we didn't do an overall reliability score. Cronbach himself recommended that researchers not run an overall score on a multidimensional scale. So if it's measuring multiple dimensions or multiple factors, the way the analysis works, it tends to create like a deflated score for the overall value. And there's some other references that I came across that said the same thing. So we just reported subscales, alphas, for the reliability. And so what we saw was 0.79 for factor 1 sensation orientation, 0.75 for factor 2 mental orientation, and 0.69 for factor 3 external orientation. And the reliability scores were within the acceptable range of 0.6, according to Palant. I think that's how you say their name. So some limitations of the study: we didn't have a random sample, so right off the bat, there may be some sampling bias going on. And kind of with that, our sample turned out to be primarily white, cisgendered, and educated, as were the researchers. So probably some problems there. Future research should include confirmatory factor analysis to yield convergent and discriminant validity. This is a part of the reading that I got confused on, because there seems to be mixed opinions about whether or not you should run EFA and CFA in the same data. I did come across a forum where a journal article or editor said that he recently desk rejected 2 papers because they ran EFA and CFA on the same data. So I went back and looked at the papers that I had used as kind of references, as guides when I was doing the writing, and I saw like some of them did both, but they did like a what they call it, like a split half method, where they took the sample and randomly split it in 2 groups, and they did EFA and CFA that way. I didn't have a big enough sample to do that because I would have needed like over 600 to do that. So I played it safe and stopped with exploratory factor analysis for this study. Another limitation is the 0.69 external orientation score. Alpha score is considered questionable by a lot of researchers. The universal standard for cutoff is 0.7. And kind of the paper that is the most widely cited for that is by Hare et al., who suggested the 0.7. However, in that paper, they also said that 0.6 is acceptable, especially for like more exploratory research. And so in light of that, especially given the exploratory nature of this, and it's, you know, so close to the universal cutoff, we argued in the paper that we felt like that it was acceptable, especially at least for this stage in the research. And I know that's a big mouthful, everything I just said, so I thought I'd just try to throw together this flow chart, and maybe we can summarize it and simplify what we went over. So first thing we did is we determined what we wanted to measure, and in our case, it was orientation. Then we determined the format, so the format's a 4-point Likert. We generated a pool of items. We had 196. We then gave those items to a panel of experts or panels of experts using content validity ratio. And they reduced that to 30 items. And then we did 5 rounds of pilot testing to reduce it to 15 items. And then we administered the 15-item version to a bigger sample of 361 participants. We tested assumptions. We did an exploratory factor analysis, which revealed the 3 factors and 12 items. We tested reliability, and then we wrote a paper. And here is what the final paper version looks like. So participants can score how they feel each of these items represent them. And then they carry their scores over into these different white boxes, and then they total up their score down here. So they'll get a mental score, external score, a sensation score. And then they put their letters in order from highest to lowest. So if I were to take this, my highest would be M, so I'd put M first. External would be second, so I'd put external here. E, sensation would be last, so I'd put S here, and that creates like a 3-letter code, kind of like a Myers-Briggs does, you know, with their 4-letter code. It's real similar. So that creates an orientation type, is what we call it, which the nickname for that is striving, which fits me very well. And there's also like a digital online version. If anybody wanted to check it out, you can go to constructedawareness.scale.com. Had a web developer friend make this, and it's really cool because like at the end of it, you get your score, and then it takes you to another page where you can review information about your type, where it talks about descriptions and your character traits and your attachment styles, communication style, and all that kind of stuff, which at this point is all theoretical. So that's what this is the first step toward developing evidence for the model. And that's it. And I'm assuming that the slides will be available somehow. I'll share those. So all these references are here, the ones that I found really useful along the way.
Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, if you share the slides with us, we'll go ahead and post those, but we'll also put this recording on YouTube. So thank you so much for sharing that.
For having me.
Any questions for Tyler before we hand the mic over to MJ? And of course, we'll always leave time at the end for questions too.
I just want to make sure you see the awesome shout out in the chat to you.
Yes, absolutely.
Hey, Larry. Thank you.
Okay, MJ, I'm giving you co-host permissions.
Oh my gosh, I feel the
No.
power.
I know. I don't know what you're going to do with all that power. Don't let it go to your head.
No, nothing's allowed to go to my head till defense. So
Right. Then we can celebrate.
absolutely. All right, slides coming up okay for everyone?
Yep, there it is.
Perfect. All right, so my name is MJ. I am a doctoral candidate. I defend on April 4th, so cross fingers for me. Appreciate you all being my guinea pigs. While this is not my defense presentation, it's much abbreviated. Hopefully we'll be able to work through some things, and it's still good practice for the verbiage. I've been a therapist in Ohio since 2016. Yeah, I have my supervisor's license. I do forensic work, crisis, trauma, all of those wonderful things that involve dramatic episodes in people's lives, which is initially what led me to my topic and the development. So I was starting to work for my dream company, my employer, R3 Continuum, who is integral in the success of this project, right around the same time that I was getting accepted into the program. And because I love what I do and I believe in the mission of my company to do that, I approached them about helping me with convenience sampling and if they had an idea of something that they needed help with. Well, so they were the ones that really put me on the track of my topic. Now, to be clear, I do not get paid. I am not reimbursed. I am given no favor whatsoever from my employer. This is something that I chose to do, and they were generous enough to help me with no expectation of return. So with that, what I am trying to do, so to create my wonderful thing is called a DERSI. I'll explain the acronym in a bit. But just some general tips about when you're thinking about what you want to create or how you want to create it. Make sure you read the research, as much of it as you can get your hands on, because in order to create an assessment, you need to have something rather specific. And not only the topic, but also your target audience for use of that. And being able to have access to subject matter experts or other people who are in both that field and are data analyzers, data creators, is really helpful. Because something that I did not know going into this that I learned awesomely is that everything that you are assessing must have a unique and non-overlapping definition. So for my product, which I'll show you guys in a bit, I have 5 domains. I have to make sure that each 5 of those are clearly defined and do not have overlapping characteristics of each other, because that would convolute my data and potentially skew it in really harmful ways. So for me, what did I want to measure? My company partners with a lot of EAPs across the nation, and our expertise is providing acute psychological first aid like interventions to employees after experiencing a disruptive event in the workplace. So if you've heard of psychological first aid, CISM, MF, mental health first aid, like there's so many modalities. And unfortunately, every single one of them is usually assessed by a post-test only, not a pre-test, just a post-test of the participants, but it's been catered directly to their intervention or the model that the company that is bringing forth the talent, so to speak, what outcomes they want to measure. So there isn't really a clear, established, objective format that can assess this broad category of interventions, to the best of my finding in this research. So was there a need here? Absolutely. I could find decades of research where in their recommended for future or in their asks for future things, they asked for this type of tool. So that was important to be able to identify. And also making sure there wasn't something else out there that kind of already did that, or at least if it is out there, is it respected? Is it built into best practices? And if not, okay, then that's still something to explore too. And for me, my stakeholders are the mental health providers, but also the companies that would then help the providers get access to this population that's clearly in need of support. Because if there's a better way to do something, I think we all would all agree, we'd like to know what the better thing is. And so also supervisors, right? If I don't have a way to measure the effectiveness of my supervisee, how am I giving them feedback? How am I justifying the recommendations that I'm giving them, right? So there are just so many possible benefits here of trying to create this kind of tool. So my least favorite part of the entire process was making my wonderful comprehensive instructions, because of course I made all my charts, right? Oh, everybody knows what this is. No, no, they do not. Um, so, um, and oh my gosh, I totally lost my train of thought. Here we go. I was gonna bring my measure over so y'all can kind of see a little bit. Are you able to see that? Okay. So my disruptive event response scoring instrument. So all of these instructions have to take place first so that anyone using this instrument understands what it is they are doing and how they are defining each step of the process. And because I'm trying to assess the effectiveness of a product, I need to capture a baseline and the effect afterwards, which is how I came up with that pre-post test model. So then down here, of course, I would like to gather some demographic things, but these are my 5 domains and underneath each of the non-overlapping definitions. So I'll leave that there for a moment while I kind of chat about this. So each of these domains were highlighted in research, particularly interactive engagement, sense of safety, but also self-efficacy. So having the belief that I can return to work, that I can get better from and overcome whatever this was. And then later verified by SMEs, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that was a little bit about that. Oh, never mind. It was in my slides. This is what happens when you make slides late at night, guys. All right. So now we understand how we got there. What did I do with it? Tyler mentioned Adelphi. I absolutely also started with Adelphi. So the purpose of Adelphi is to use subject matter experts to at least theoretically confirm that your measure should, ideally, theoretically, measure what it's supposed to, and based on their years of expertise. You need a minimum of 8 individuals to create a quorum or forum, and the goal is to achieve a minimum of 80% consensus or higher. I was able to get 96% consensus after 2 rounds with very minor edits. So that let me go on to kind of the next phase, which would be piloting. So of course, what am I looking for in my pilot? Well, research question 1 was already confirmed by the Delphi, right? So I can chalk that one up as to being complete. But does it have inter-rater reliability? And I use the intra-class correlation coefficient because I have nominal data. So there are categories, right? And I need to making sure that you have a statistic that is calculating the type of data you're working with. Otherwise, you get into really fun conversions that don't always work. And then, of course, do they have construct validity? Is Pearson's correlation coefficient or Pearson's R? And then I chose to do a multiple linear regression, actually, because there were very specific demographic variables that could reasonably create skew. So things like what license type do you have? What state are you licensed in, right? Because different states have different training expectations, different education expectations, age, how long you've been doing this kind of work. But also because I was partnering with my company for access to some material, I also needed to figure out if the individuals had already seen the vignettes that I was using to test my measure against. Just to make sure there wasn't that kind of familiarity or skew in their scores either. Now, what I'm referring to is in the setup of my, how I had to set up this survey was they had to do their informed consent, right? And then demographic variables, cool. And none of my demographic variables were identifying. And I was double blinded to the participants that my company was helping me gain access to. And then they would watch the first half of a vignette, answer the DERSI. And then they would watch the second half of a vignette and they would complete the DERSI and 5 other gold standard measures. Because again, I have 5 domains. So each of my 5 domains has to be compared to a gold standard measure that effectively assesses each of these things. So the general self-efficacy scale, there's a workplace safety one, and these again were I was helped in choosing them by my subject matter experts to compare, are the definition that we're creating similar enough to these definitions? But of course, with the pilot study for me, my sample size was 11. So a lot of type 2 error, because my scores were all over the place. I can't do anything really much with that. But I did have at least one significant outcome to one of my domains, which is really what got me the IRB approval to go ahead and do a full scale. Because there was no feedback reporting like harm or concern, right? I had the resources to do so. And also, there wasn't anything that said, nope, this doesn't work in a very clear, definitive way that would have defeated the purpose of moving on. So, show my domains again so we know what we're talking about. Because then when I got to do my full scale study, according to GPower, I needed a minimum sample size of 76. I was able to get 80 data points and use them all, which was really exciting. Now, I had 690 people take the survey, but only 80 people completed the survey. And completed it in such a way that allowed me to use the data. So they didn't have like answering C across all the things, right? Or something that obviously showed that they weren't being attentive to the study. And a big part of that was because of the length of my survey. It would take the average clinician approximately an hour to an hour 15, because each of those vignettes is about 20 minutes. Now you could pause, you could come back to it, and I made that very well known. But then also I got a lot of emails actually from people with feedback about they weren't sure if they qualified for the study. And a big part of that is because there are so many different words used to describe crisis, trauma, CISM, right? And there's not a clear, identifiable, inclusive word that all professionals unilaterally know. And so they didn't realize that they were qualified, many of them. So what happened? Reliability was awesome. If it has 2 asterisks, that means that it had high reliability. 1 asterisk is moderate reliability. No asterisks would be low reliability. So I was very excited to see that we had mostly high iterator reliability there, which is super exciting. And validity. So only 3 of my 5 domains showed construct validity. Now this can happen for a lot of reasons. I did not put the gold standard measures after the pre-test. I only did it after the post-test. So I had to compare my scores both as what's called the delta variable, so my post-test minus pre-test, before I do my calculations of scoring. And I also compared them to just the pre-tests and just the post-tests. And across the board, post-tests came up significant every time. But because as soon as I added the pre-test data, I lost 2 of my variables. So it's very possible that if I did this again and put the gold standard measures after both sections, I may get different results. It's also possible that the gold standard measures that I identified don't quite match what my definition of those things are. And the biggest reason for that is because my measure is not meant to assess a clinical diagnosable intervention. So it's not a treatment modality. It is not helping me identify symptoms from the DSM. It is something that's trying to evaluate the style of a consulting intervention that mental health providers provide. And so because there aren't measures that assess those, the next closest thing I can use are the clinical measures. That's how we get there. And I am so happy to say that absolutely none of my demographic variables skewed my results in any way. And all showed clear rainbows, sunshine, all the wonders. So that makes me happy. So some things I would change. Obviously, we talked about the pre-test, post-test words. With the gold standard measures. I would also like to be able to incentivize and or compensate my participants. Fun fact, university policy says absolutely not. You cannot even raffle off a gift card. And there are wonderful ethical reasons for some of those decisions, but also in the last 10 years, there are plenty of articles that show that incentivizing does not affect your results in those negative skew ways either. So an argument could be made either way. But if I was going out on my own, I would want to, compensate them, especially in today where there's a higher need of professionals than there are available, I'm asking them for a billable hour of their time, and that's a big deal, right? I would also want to broaden my participant pool to some of the non-licensed individuals who hold certificates that allow them to do these services. CISM has its own certification, PFA has its own certification, and civilians who are non-mental health licensed individuals can obtain those certifications and do these services. So why not include them in that, to see if there's any difference? Like, do we need to maybe take that into something that only licensed individuals do, or is it still good as a shared opportunity? And then also for my couple domains that didn't have the significant results, I would want to explore if there are other gold standard measures to maybe consider additional comparisons to. But that was a bit about my journey. I am not as awesome as Tyler. So if you would like references, please email me. If you want to chat, please email me. I will happily do all the things. But my references pages were like 15 pages long. And so I did not want to sit here for the next 10 minutes scrolling through the slides that would take. But yes, so I will just put this back there. So, you know, contact info. Hey, questions? I'm delightfully awkward, sorry.
Thank you. Questions for MJ? I think everyone's minds are blown from both of your presentation.
Yeah,
I know, I think a lot of people have the glossy eyes, and that's really okay. This happens every time people say, oh, what are you doing for your dissertation?
I gave
Yes, let me
myself
talk to you
lots
about stats.
so many times doing this stuff.
Right.
great job. I do have a question for both of you. I haven't really gotten too deep into the methodology, so I appreciate both of your explanations and different components that I hadn't quite considered. But how do you reconcile the conflicts that exist within the literature? I mean, literature would state like sample size needs to be this, or ratio this needs to be this, and even within one article there are contradictions. Like how did you decide to reconcile those conflicts when you were making decisions?
So for me, I did a couple things. One, I looked at what was most recent, and also, but was it so recent that it was still too new, right? Like, was I not able to find enough to substantiate that decision? And I also would lean on my subject matter experts and explain and have them explain that more from a practical application standpoint, which type of data makes sense. Because if you notice, my I can bring it back up again if I need to, but my measure is very short because again, the intervention we're assessing is short. And if I ask a clinician to sit here and fill out this like 5-page report, we're not going to do it. So being able to check. So that's what made for me with a short form versus a lot of newer measures recommend starting with a longer form and then adjusting to an abbreviated form. But it wasn't going to be as applicable here. Those are some of my thoughts.
And sometimes I think you just make a case based off what's available in the literature. It's like that 0.69 for external, you know, the cutoff that most people I think would say is 0.7, but I saw like there was stuff that was 0.6, 0.5. It was kind of all over the place, you know, so it's just like, just reference everything you can and make a case for, you know, what works, I guess.
And also give credit to the other side. I'm sorry, Tyler, I didn't mean to cut you off. But yeah, if you choose a direction, be able to say what the opposite direction would have been and why you didn't choose that for your study. So you do have to know both, but sometimes you just have to decide.
I think it's so cool that our assessments are so different and the methods to develop them were completely different too. I think that.
I mean, we both did a Delphi, a pilot, and a full-scale study.
Yeah.
Yeah, but our statistical analysis is slightly different, but the type of data we were gathering is different. And you're looking to assess an intervention that's more that clinical long-term relationship that can be tracked over time, whereas I'm looking for a one and done. Some of the high-level differences that I found, but it was interesting to see that the same steps were here.
Mine's more like a personality scale, but that's a
Mhm.
problem. I think that illustrates the problem that I was running into because like you can
Mhm.
read paper after paper about scale development and they're all doing different stuff, and it's because they're all measuring different things and they're measuring in different
Mhm.
ways. So it was hard for me to make sense of like, okay, what do I need to do?
Mhm.
And you mentioned like having experts help, and I felt completely lost in the weeds until
Mhm.
LA offered to help. So give her a shout out. It's like that's when she was like, "Oh, you should look in this direction." And that's when everything started because I could recognize like, okay, I can reject this that I'm reading. That's not helpful, and then
Mhm.
identify what was helpful from my scale.
I'm glad you mentioned support too, because one thing, I mean, dissertation in general can be a very lonely journey, but I think when you're doing a topic that is even smaller niche, it can feel even more isolating. Um, so making sure that you connect with other people, right? Don't be siloed in your project, because that's really a quick way to frustration. And also share your work, right? People are excited to chat about it with you. You just got to figure out which rock we're under.
I'm curious, what was your biggest challenge out of all of the different steps in your development? Because there's many steps. Were there any particular steps where you got there and you're like, maybe I really don't want to do this. Or maybe I should just go and do something else or find some self-efficacy survey that's already been done. Or maybe I'll just give them a personality. Maybe we'll just do a big factor. We'll just do the big five and call it a day. Like, how did you, keep going in times of frustration whenever you hit that challenge?
You want me to jump in, MJ?
Yeah, go first. I'm contemplating.
The most frustrating part was over 2 years of trying to, without understanding what to do, trying to come up with a way to assess it. I don't know if I mentioned this is the fifth attempt at trying to figure out how to measure orientation. And so, just working off just the theory and my understanding of it would try to come up with different ways, and it just wasn't measuring right. I would, we would do it in trainings, for example, in CA trainings, and the participants like their orientations, what you just, they'd be like, I scored this way, and I'm like, really? Just based off like my understanding, like my read on them. And so that was like over 2 years of just spinning my wheels of trying to figure out, and then like, okay, reinvent the wheel, right? And just come up. There was so many different ways. I guess my step on like the format. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Like how to format the assessment was the part that really messed me up the most.
I had a couple points. One of them was I knew how I wanted to set it up, but then I had a lot of blanks that I needed to go back and fill in. So it felt like I was going backwards to go forwards, which is uniquely frustrating. The other piece, though, for me was when I was in data collection, because I originally, like I said, I partnered with my employer. They double blinded the data. So a completely different department was sending out my recruitment messaging, keeping it anonymous. I never knew who it was. Um, but about 3 months in, nothing. And I had my heart set on graduating this May. But that's out of my control, right? So that's hard. So then it was time to get creative. So I emailed all 50 states' mental health licensing boards and asked for if they had a public records contact list of their licensees that included an email address. Not most, I think I got like 8 back that, yep, it has an email. A lot of them don't have the email address, which was going to be a barrier for me. And then some of them want you to pay like a lot for them. So I'm like, okay, like I don't mind a $35 administration fee, but I have an issue with $400. Like, so making some of these choices. But once I was able to expand, but then of course, every time you make a change, you got to go to IRB, right? Yeah, so you got to make sure it makes sense, have your ducks in a row. So a lot of the back and forth was frustrating.
Any other questions? But I really appreciate you both just taking the time to do this. And, this is a great resource for our students who are considering developing an assessment or instrument or taking on this kind of project for their studies, whether it's part of their dissertation or whether it's like Tyler, a passion project for a number of years. So I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop recording. So if you all want to ask a question that is not recorded, feel free.